Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to the Prophet Noah series, where we're continuing on showing the continuity and connections between Nebi Yusuf and Nebi Musa and how this relates to Noah's Ark. Thematically, saving humanity individually and collectively from a destructive, unnatural way of life and re-entering a natural life through Allah's mercy and protection and guidance. So in the last episode, we were discussing the symbolism of weaving related to riding, related to nomadic life. In this episode, it is titled The Casket and the Covenant. So we will visit more about Nebi Musa's story and Nebi Yusuf's story, alayhum salam, in their particulars in a future future series related to each individual prophet, inshallah. And perhaps we'll show some other connections at that point. But in this episode, what we're going to do is we're going to skip over the period where Nebi Musa has returned from exile with a mission from Allah to save his people, to save the enslaved. We cannot claim to be followers of Nebi Musa in the least if we're in favor in making excuses for slavery in any shape or form. It's literally impossible. And anyone who claims descent from Nebi Musa and his people, those who had been enslaved, cannot hope or wish for or desire any form of enslavement for any humans ever. So consider this strongly. So now, he's now returned and he's got this mission and he's confronting Pharaoh, who is the archetype of Dajjal, of the liar, the deceiver. So he is the Imam, he is the Caliph, he is the exemplar of the rightly guided one. He's the archetype in this instance. So the Caliph to come, alayhi salam, we can look at as the Musa of the age, because he's going to be pulling his people from the brink of genocide and destruction, from the brink of total enslavement, and bringing them out of the unnatural, artificial world, inshallah, into the wilds, into the wilderness, into an organic, holistic way of living, and back into a purified expression of Islam. So he gets his people freed. Now they go to the water, but before they're getting ready to go to the water, before he splits the sea, whether it's the Reed Sea or the Red Sea, there's a scene that's discussed in Genesis whereby Nebi Yusuf, when he passed away, he was highly respected within Egyptian society. He had status. He was the second most powerful, according to the scriptures, he was the second most powerful man in Egypt, the vizier, the vice regent, so to speak. And he was buried, in some accounts, he was buried in the Nile. Some say in a metal or a lead sarcophagus, in a coffin that was put into the Nile, and then the Nile would flood, and the blessings of his bones would go out into the fields and benefit them. However, there are accounts that say he was built he was buried in a typical Egyptian tomb. And we know that the Egyptians were really into stone tombs and monuments. So when I read that he was buried in the Nile, I know that there are examples all around the world of monuments and mazars, turbes, maqams being built on small islands in the middle of a river. So I imagine that it might have been actually on a small island and that he was buried there in some kind of a tomb structure. And this may have been visited by Bani Israil to make dua, to remember his story, to remember their history, to have a common connecting point for the community. So people would make ziyarat to this location and remember their spiritual and genetic ancestries. And remember the stories and tell the stories and learn the lesson and share the lessons with the youth as they were growing up. So maybe they got a day off occasionally and they would go and visit Nebi Yusuf's tomb. Because the thing is, in some of the accounts that came later, people they didn't even know where the tomb was, and this seems strange to me. So I think that the Bani Israil actually knew where he was buried. Now, Allahu Alam. But this is something that should be explored. This is why, as an ummah, we need to have the best scholars in the world when it comes to studying the prophets and the prophetic traditions in all scriptures of the world. We need the best comparative religionists. We need the best social historians and linguists. Like, no more lazy scholarship. No more trying to just shove things away. Like, so it's time to actually look at things carefully. So I'm suggesting a lot of trails that we can begin exploring, inshallah. And I know many of our scholars have actually already begun in these ways, and we need a new synthesis of information. We need to bring the strands together and see what the big picture is, because we are in some very dangerous times, and there are many lessons that we can learn. But a lot of what I'm suggesting are things on the other side of this, because remember, our Nabi, peace be upon him, he says if you're planting a tree and the end of the world comes, finish planting your tree. Also, we should live every day as if it is our last, and plan for our future like we're going to live 1,000 years. And also in terms of scholarship, as far as that's concerned, we should never do anything that could endanger our the growing minds and expanding hearts of our youth from being able to look at data and assess it for themselves with all the tools to engage in a rigorous and thoroughgoing study. That is theft. And if a scholar is engaged in trying to shut people off from thinking critically and looking at all the source materials and looking at all the cognates and connections, then this is very, very wrong and very sinful. Now, let's get back to this tomb. So, Nabi Yusuf is buried. He's in the middle of the river. And however he was taken out, he was in a casket. And before leaving, Bani Israil, they go and they get his body. They get the bones. This is very important. They get his bones and they carry the casket out with them. And then when Nabi Musa when he strikes the ground with his staff on Allah's command, and it splits the sea, and they walk through on dry land and they get to the other side, and Pharaoh's forces are pursuing them. And then the waters come crashing down. As soon as Bani Israil is to safety on the other side, Allah brings a flood upon Pharaoh and his peoples, and they are eliminated. So it's interesting because now we have another connection to the Nabi Nuh alayhi salam story. So they're eliminated and they're no longer pursuing. However, I would argue that by studying history and studying historical patterns, we can assume that, and also seeing what came over the next 40 years while Bani Israil wanders in the desert, that Pharaoh, he had his agents placed strategically throughout these escaped slaves. These humans who had been enslaved wrongfully are now wandering in the desert, but they've got enemies amongst them. And so sometimes when we're seeing condemnations of Bani Israil, which had many walis among them, by the way, may Allah be pleased with them, that we also can see that there were agents of the shayateen amongst them, initiates and brotherhood members that were trying to get people off track and take them back to devilry and encourage them to cultivate their nafs and also cultivate collective nafs. So as they are wandering, the story is that they brought Nabi Yusuf's bones with them until they entered back into Al-Quds, until they entered into the Holy Land, into Canaan, and then they took back Canaan. At this point, it's interesting. At that point, they buried his bones with Nabis Ibrahim, Ishaq, and Yaqub. Peace be upon all of them. So they carried his bones, and the discussion, I called this the casket and the covenant, because there's this casket, and what they would carry it in front of the casket, according to the story, because we see the Ark of the Covenant arise, another ark, but not described as a boat, more as a casket, a coffin, or a chest, a treasure chest. And this was, according to the stories, it was given to Nabi Musa as a design from Allah while he was on Mount Sinai during the 40 days of fasting. Allahu Alam, but at some point the ark is designed and created, and the legends say it contains the 10 Commandments, the stones with the 10 Commandments. It contains a bag of manna, according to some of the things I'd read. I'd heard other objects are in there that were sacred to Bani Israil. And so it's a treasure chest, and it contains these things. And there are many stories about the ark that we'll discuss later that are very interesting, about it being electrified and all kinds of interesting possibilities. But what's interesting is I read that the Ark of the Covenant would go ahead of the people as they were walking through the wilderness. It would be at the front of their lines. And it would be held on wooden poles, almost like a casket. The same way that pallbearers carry a casket. And they've each got their holding on to the poles, the wooden poles, the sticks that are on either side of the casket. So you'll have maybe 6, 8 men carrying a casket with someone in it. So the Ark of the Covenant is very similar to this. And they said that next to the Ark of the Covenant, as they would march it in front of them as they wandered, and also if they went into battle, the Ark of the Covenant went first. But what's interesting is I read accounts that the coffin or casket of Nabi Yusuf alayhi salam would be walked next to the Ark of the Covenant. Could it be? Now these are just thoughts, these are ideas. Could it be that the casket containing the bones of this Nabi, which also this is related to, it's an ark for our ancestors, carrying the righteous ancestors, the best of our ancestral lines are being carried in an ark, in a coffin, a boat, a vehicle that's traveling with human feet with wooden poles. Now it's interesting, this conceptualization. Could it be that the original Ark of the Covenant actually was Nabi Yusuf's coffin or casket with the bones in it, and then later they put other objects in it, and maybe the casket was wearing down, it was decaying, so they built a new box, and there was a new design that was put into it, that was given to Nabi Musa alayhi salam somehow. This is speculation. I'm speculating, of course, but sometimes we've got to brainstorm and speculate in order to discover possible truth options, in order for us, lines of thinking that we need to go down as scholars, as thinkers, as problem solvers. Because the whole point of scholarship is to problem solve in order to discover practical ways of approaching life in order for us to be near the truth and to draw near unto truth, inshallah, and to bring ourselves and bring our communities out of suffering and back to the garden, inshallah, as close to the garden as we can before we are permitted to re-enter, inshallah. So just consider that Nabi Yusuf is now in nomadic mode. He is moving with the people in his bones. And there's a barakat, a blessing upon the people through his bones. And perhaps when the Ark of the Covenant was designed, perhaps his bones were taken out of a decaying casket and put into that. Perhaps they weren't separate. Maybe they were brought together into one. A sacred object containing sacred objects. These are possibilities. So we just need to consider these. So until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.